now, like, what I love about what I do, it's like when somebody finds you, they're so happy to talk to you. They're like, I've tried to talk to you, I've talked to 30 financial planners in the last 40 years and nobody's been able to help me out with this stuff, right? So it has been, the cross-border stuff has been so gratifying. Even, we do a lot of stuff online with like YouTube videos, and people are just so happy to be able to get some knowledge about this area in which they didn't have before.
Welcome to the Modern Sense Podcast, your financial-friendly podcast navigating the ever-evolving world of personal finance. Join me, Andrea Thompson, for insightful interviews and non-traditional perspectives on modern finance. Let's redefine the way we think about money together. Welcome to today's podcast. I'm thrilled to have Bryan Haggard, CEO of Retire Mitten Financial, a fee-only financial planning firm located in Milford, Michigan. Retire Mitten specializes in helping U.S.-based families that have worked in both the U.S. and Canada navigate the complexities of cross-border retirement planning, which I have to mention is quite similar to what Modern Sense does, and in a way, I consider you to be our counterpart on the other side of the border. So welcome, Bryan. Thanks for joining me today.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Andrea. Appreciate it. I'm really looking forward to it. Great job on the intro, by the way.
No, thanks. I appreciate it. Okay, so first thing I have to mention, I did look up Milford, Michigan on Google Maps, and it looks like it's a very small village with a population of about 6,500 people. And I don't know if you know this, but interestingly, we're only about a 4-hour drive apart. So I thought that was kind of cool.
I know we're not very far apart. I didn't know how many people we had in our little village here. We are certainly not very big. People ask the question all the time, how did you get this name Retire Mitten? Which, do you know how we have that name,
That
Andrea?
was one of my questions. And actually, I was thinking about it this morning, and I thought, does it have something to do with why it's colder in Canada and we wear mittens up here? Or am I totally off base?
That's not... People come up with lots of different reasons why Retire Mitten is a thing. And it is actually because Michigan is the mitten state. If you look at Michigan, it's like a mitten. And as a result, I named my firm Retire Mitten. Now, for people who are thinking, gosh, the name of my, if you're thinking about starting a firm and you're like, I really need to nail the name of my firm, let me tell you, you don't need to nail it at all. Nobody knows what Retire Mitten means. Most of my clients, when I started the firm, I'm like, yeah, they'll be from Michigan, and so they'll know what it is. None of my clients are even from Michigan, or very few are even from Michigan. So it doesn't make sense to anybody, but that's how Retire Mitten came up, and that's my story about Michigan. And my only other good story about Michigan is where we are. We're probably one of the few places in America in which we have to drive south to get to Canada. So most places, I would say that's probably not the case, right? So anyway, those are my two things about where I live.
And is Milford considered a border town?
No, we're kind of right in the middle of the state. And so no, it's kind of a boring little town. We're known because General Motors has a proving grounds here. So it's kind of cool. We see a lot of new General Motors cars driving around, but no, nothing super special.
And so how did you end up there? Are you from there? Did you grow up there, or how did you land your body in Milford, Michigan?
I'm from about 25 minutes away. My folks are from here. I spent about 12 years in Colorado after college, and then me and my wife, after we got married, said, let's move back to Michigan. And just so happened that this is a pretty cool town. So, set up our roots here and been here ever since.
Well, it looks really charming on the website of Milford, Michigan. So if anyone is looking to drive through Michigan, I love a little charming called Village. It's not even called a town. It's called a village, which is very quaint. And I love that. So, love that you've situated yourself there, and it looks like a beautiful life.
If you're driving through, Andrea, please let me know. We have a great coffee shop. We also have a great bourbon bar here as well. So a little bit of everything for depending on
Yeah,
what you're
you
looking for.
definitely find me at the coffee shop. And I don't know in the US if they make a flat white, but that's a very popular type of coffee in Canada. Are you familiar with a flat white, by the way? Hi.
I'm not. I've heard of that term, but I don't know
It's
what it
basically like
is.
a cappuccino, but it's not frothy milk. It's just warmed milk, if that makes it any clearer.
Oh,
So a lot
interesting.
of
Okay.
people don't like really frothy things where you get that milk lip. Anyway, this is offside, but it's one of those small US Canada differences, which is why I brought it up. Because I do find that we do have a lot of similarities, but there are very small differences when you cross the border that you'll only notice in certain circumstances. Like if we go to your McDonald's, you don't have vinegar packets.
No, that's true. That's it. I wish we
We
did.
put a lot of vinegar in our French fries.
We don't have poutine here,
Exactly.
right?
We don't have poutine. And then you don't have
Yeah.
ketchup chips in the US either, which is something we have a lot of up here.
That is also true. Now we do have Tim
Oh,
Hortons
no
in our
way.
area at least.
Okay.
So
But that's not the
yeah,
coffee shop you're talking about, I'm sure.
no, it is not.
All right. Well,
So
let's get back on track. So first, I would love to hear about what is your connection to Canada? I would love to hear a little bit more about yourself, about your history in finance and how you ended up in cross-border. And does that have to do with you, yourself, and your family, or how did you get here?
sure, yeah, absolutely. I wish I had more a great story about being part Canadian or having family in Canada. I don't. I've traveled to Canada a handful of times, but I really don't have a lot of ties to Canada outside of just being 30 minutes away from the border. The reason I got into cross-border planning, I would say, gosh, now it's maybe 14 years ago. I was working at a large investment management firm, RIA, here in the United States and here in Michigan. And I had, responsible for having, 400 or 500 clients at the time. And I didn't really know a lot of my clients because you have so many, but I knew them, but you don't get in-depth planning at that point. And I had a client that came in. I was relatively new to this. And he said, "Hey, Bryan, I'm from Canada. And as a result, I have a Canada pension plan. I think I have this OAS benefit. I'm going to have a reduction to my Social Security because of this WEP reduction and because of my Canada pension. And how can you help me?" And I was like, "I've never heard of any of these things before. I have no idea what you're talking about, right? But I'm fairly new here. I will go get one of the other 20 financial planners that are here to help me, right? Somebody has to know, like we're 30 minutes from the border. We work with 4,000 people. I'm sure this comes up quite a bit." So I went and talked to my 10 other financial planners that I work with, and they're all like, "Yeah, I think I've heard of that before, but I don't know." And nobody had any good answers. And I didn't want to come back to him and just say, "Yep, we can't help you. We have no idea what you're talking about. I've never heard of this." So I actually ordered a book on Amazon again, a long time ago. And I was like, let me just start to figure this out as I can. Started to spend a lot of time on like the CRA website, the Service Canada website, I digging through like the old US Canada totalization agreement, figuring out what this WEP reduction thing was, like just trying to learn as much as I could. And I ended up developing like this really big spreadsheet form to say, "Hey, here's what your CPP and your OAS and your WEP reduction." And he was like blown away, right? He's like, "Nobody else has been able to help me with this. Thank you so much." And I was like, "This is pretty cool that I was able to do this." And he found it to be helpful. I've looked back at that spreadsheet. I don't know how accurate it was, but it was good enough, right? It was a pretty good first try. And then what we realized is like our company specialized in General Motors employees. Pretty much all of our clients were General Motors employees. And a lot of our clients had come from like Canadian plants and now had moved to the US. So we actually had a lot of Canadian clients. So like who now live in the US. So almost all of my clients, my specialty, kind of the mirror of you, Andrea, is like I kind of specialize in US residents, right? Where you're on the Canadian side. And we realized we had a lot of those people. And so anytime somebody now had a question about the Canada stuff, they would come to me and I started working with them and started learning more and more about how all of this stuff kind of works together. So I don't have a ton of, ties to Canada outside of just all of the people that I basically work with at this point are
Mhm.
from Canada.
And I have to ask you, do you remember the name of the book long ago that you picked up from Amazon?
I should have looked this up. Is it you've probably read it, or maybe you've looked at it before. It's like the Cross Border Guide. Is that what it was called? Um, I forget what it was. Keats, I think Keats and Connolly, I think, which is actually a kind of a, I guess, competing firm. But they wrote this book some time ago, and it at least gave me like a guideline of like what's
For
there,
sure.
right?
And
So
kudos to you and for being the advisor to just, instead of saying, yeah, sorry, I don't know, for figuring it out and actually taking the time to help your client, because I think that speaks highly to the type of person that you are, first of all, but also advisor and financial planner that you are. So thank you for that. And also, I'm sure lots of people at this point will also say thank you for being able to help navigate those waters, because it isn't easy. It does require a lot of digging and a lot of going on the websites and figuring out what you can and piecing it together. I don't know if you've ever had anyone ask you, how did you learn cross-border, or can you teach me cross-border? It's not easy. It's not like there's one place to go to and then you just learn cross-border. It's quite complex.
yeah, it's not like, like I think you're a certified financial planner and, I'm a certified financial planner, right? So sometimes I like go back to my books and figure out like, okay, like what are kind of all of your financial planning topics are in one spot, right? But like when you start to get the cross-border stuff, it's all over the place. And then you're like kind of seeing stuff online, but you're like, okay, I don't want to use that as a source, right? So like, let me kind of dig into like I said, I've probably been on the Social Security and the CRA website and this whole, Canada totalization agreement, thousands of times, right? Like just trying to find little bits and pieces that people have questions about. And then, people still want to try to get, kind of, they want to know like, how did you get this, right? Like, are you being, factual about it? So you have to try to show them a legitimate site. So, and then of course I'll bookmark that, and then that, it changes, right? Then I have to go find it again. So that's it. It's almost like a cross-border planning. It's kind of like being I don't know, searching for a sunken treasure sometimes. And then you get really excited when you kind of find
Yeah,
the
or you
answer,
think you
right?
find the answer and then you realize that there's probably 4 or 5 different answers and it's just all interpretation.
And one of the ways and this is not, when I started the business, I was like, I got this, right? Like I know how to do cross-border planning. Like I got the ins and outs. Like I've worked with a lot of people. And then, my first webinar, I said something. It wasn't like a big mistake, but it was like a little bit of a mistake. And of course, I had like 10 people, like 10 Canadians, very friendly, reach out to me and say, Bryan, I don't think that was correct. And then all send me like different sources about this as well. So like, I'd like to say at this point, I've been doing it long enough where I got it, but I still get people who kind of call me out a bit and say, actually, I think you meant this over here. And so there is a little bit of, I won't say trial and error, but there are other, some mistakes along the way that I've learned, and luckily people have kind of helped me
Absolutely.
with.
And just to kind of circle back on retirement and how this all ties in, you're focused mainly on cross-border retirement planning for US residents who have cross-border ties in many different ways. I would just love to hear a little bit from you about what does your ideal client, or what is your client that comes to you for cross-border planning look like as a predominant archetype, if you will?
Sure. So I would say our average client here, it has, worked in Canada for, let's just say 20 years. They left Canada when they were, 35, maybe 40 years old. Typically like maybe mid 30s. Traditionally pretty successful, right? The reason they left Canada is because they took an oil job here, a technology job here, right? So it's, they were doing pretty well. And then they've spent the last 20 years or so here in the US. So They have, Canadian benefits and retirement accounts that they qualify for, U.S. retirement accounts that they qualify for. And, most of the people who come to us, they're, within 5 years of retirement, right? And really our goal is to put all of this together, right? So, okay, they have, U.S., they have Social Security, and then they have their IRAs and their 401ks. In Canada, they have their Canada Pension Plan and their OAS, and then they have their RSPs and LIRAs. So it's figuring out, when can you retire? What's that look like? When to turn on all of these benefits? What's it mean as far as how much can you withdraw from the different retirement accounts in both the U.S. and Canada? And really, what are the best ways to minimize taxes for you as well? So, that's typically what we will go through with a with a new client.
Sounds really familiar, by the way. Just flip it on the other side of the border. We do a lot of cross-border. We call it decumulation planning. So again, where do you draw from and when? And I'm curious from your perspective, being on the U.S. side, how do you manage currency within your cross-border retirement planning? I know we have our way, but I would love to hear what your way is for dealing with fluctuations in the U.S. to Canadian dollar pairing.
I'd love to hear what you do, Andrea, but I'll start with what I do because I don't know the right answer. Because one of the hardest things, I tend to believe that currency exchange should not determine your financial plan. So for example, if the currency exchange today is, and I always look at it in US dollars. So like right now, if you move money from Canada, you might get 72, 73, maybe 74 cents on the dollar without looking at it exactly, which isn't awful. But it's not great. Like if you look at the last, 20 years or so of history, about 0.74, again, when you move it down here is pretty average, right? So kind of if somebody is setting up a monthly withdrawal from their Canada pension plan or the OAS, I don't look at currency fluctuations at all. I just don't care. You know what? Like it's going to change and there's nothing we can really do about it. If somebody is bringing a large lump sum over, I only have a couple rules. If they're going to get less than 70 cents on the dollar, I tell them not to bring it over. Just doesn't tend to make sense at that point. If they're between like 72 and 77, 78, to me, that's fine. Like, we don't want to sit around waiting for 20 years for the currency to improve while it's sitting in Canada in what might be investments that, because as a U.S. resident, you're really limited on what you can invest in Canada on a non-registered account. I have clients that have had money in a checking account in Canada for 20 years waiting for, the currency to get back to par, earning nothing, where they would have done much better if they just would have moved the money over, taken a little bit of a currency hit, and then invested the money, right? So if it's kind of in this middle range, I'm like, let's just move it over. Let's not wait. And then if it's over like 80 cents on the dollar, like let's just get as much over as we can. I mean, we just don't know when it's going to get back to that point. So I do, like, if you're looking at lump sums, bringing big chunks of money, I will look at the currency and I'll kind of maybe say, hey, let's wait a little bit. But I usually, if people are starting like, RSP withdrawals, like, well, I don't want to get too much into the weeds, but if they're taking, money out annually from Canada or from their CPP or OAS, it just don't really look at it.
There's not much you can do about it realistically. Yeah. Well, thank you for asking. You mentioned the 20-year, could sit there for 20 years. I actually use about a 20-year average of the USD to Canadian pairing for my financial projections. So that really is more on the, what does it look like over a long period of time if we have to use an assumption on currency. And so my currency assumption is $1.30, which again, we're going the other direction. And right now, I think we're at $1.37. So similar to you saying, if it gets to 80 cents on the dollar, we're going to convert as much as possible. We are at sort of in the opposite way, a situation where we're higher than long-term averages. Or if you look at that chart, it is quite substantial where we're at. And So if someone does have US dollars that they are not utilizing for lifestyle purposes, let's say they're not going to the US a lot, or they're not doing a lot of US based travel or travel that requires US dollars, then we'll talk about, does it make sense to look to convert more USD to CAD as part of sort of capturing some of that currency appreciation, if you will, or even just a strong currency win for that client. And you're right, that's usually with larger lump sums and in non-registered types of accounts. If we're talking about IRAs or 401ks, we're not necessarily going to recommend somebody takes more out of an IRA or a 401k just to capture that currency, because the tax impact is going to be, more significant the more we take out at a stronger currency. So we're really just talking about non-registered assets in that case. But for a lot of our clients, and I'm actually curious to know your perspective on this too, they do lead more of a snowbird or a cross-border retirement lifestyle where they're not just sitting in one country, they're sitting in two countries, and maybe it's 7 months, 5 months, something like that, where they do need to have, income in both currencies. So in that case, we're really looking to construct retirement planning and decumulation planning to provide as much income in the native currency that they require for that lifestyle purpose. And sometimes we break out, how much do we need every year in both USD and CAD, and what are those natural pensions providing already, and what currency impact do we then need to consider from the other buckets or assets?
That's interesting. So I would say most of our clients are just solely US. And some of them will have like a cottage, something in Canada where they spend a little bit of time. But my experience has been like, once they leave Canada, they go right past Michigan and they're in like Texas and Florida, and they're in and they're like not leaving, right? And one of the reasons I said a lot of my clients start, kind of when they move over here, it was like 35 or so. It's because a lot of my clients, their kids are all down here in the States at this point, right? Like they grew up in the States, spent most of their lives in the States. It's a little bit different when clients move here later, because then a lot of their kids are up north. And ultimately what we find, and you probably find this too, it's like the parents kind of end up where the grandkids are, right? Or the kids are. And as a result, I see most of my folks don't have as much of a need for Canadian dollars, right? So their objective is like, how do I get the money out of Canada? Because it's, and a lot of people, when they come to us, the money's been stuck, I'll say stuck in Canada for 30 years. They haven't been able to place trades in their accounts. They're kind of getting charged relatively high management fees compared to what somebody might charge here in the US. Like, it has just been there, and they're like, I just want to get it out of there. What's the tax ramification? What's the best way to do it? So I can actually do something more with it, right? So I have and then also like for estate planning reasons, like, as a US resident, it's a little bit of a hassle to pass away with a lot of Canadian assets, right? So for that reason as well, a lot of my clients will, if you're thinking about like which accounts to draw first, a lot of times their theory, and ours is as well, like, let's start to kind of fund some of your retirement with some of the Canadian dollars, regardless of kind of bringing it back to the exchange rate, like kind of regardless of what the exchange rate is. Hey, at some point they kind of know they're going to have a hit, or at least most people know. If it got back to par, then yeah, we'd be seeing like gigantic RSP withdrawals, left and right.
Yeah,
So
that's really interesting, because in the US, most RIAs cannot hold Canadian dollar portfolios, correct?
Yeah, and I can't either. So what we really help our clients with is like, and let's just say, for an example, a client needs $100,000 a year in retirement withdrawals. And what we kind of help our clients with is, okay, where should that 100,000 come from? Should it come from all Canadian dollars? Should it come from, or like RSPs? Should it come from US dollars, like pre-tax or after tax? A combination of both. And that's where it really kind of gets tricky as well, is like, right now here in the US, we have pretty low tax rates, and that's set to maybe change here in a couple of years. And so, does it make more sense right now to draw money from US retirement accounts when tax rates are lower, or does it make sense to take money from Canadian accounts in which we might have higher tax withholding? And what our, and again, you're probably like this too, Andrea, like our job is just to kind of educate, right? Like, here's your options. This is what it will look like if you drew it from the Canadian accounts. This is what it looked like if you drew it from the US accounts. A lot of times I'll give my opinion or kind of talk to them about like, this is what we usually do. But like, I want them to be educated ultimately to make those decisions,
Absolutely.
right?
Yeah. It's so interesting, those small differences, because you're talking about, drawing money and looking at withholding taxes and having a lower tax regime in the US, where we have in a way the opposite problem. So, we're not necessarily concerned about the impact of US taxation as much. Yes, we're always going to incorporate and look at what are the withholdings requirements, are we going to get enough back in foreign tax credits, et cetera. But we're actually able to hold US dollar accounts in Canada because that's very normal for us. So there's US dollar non-registered accounts, there's US dollar RRSPs, we have US dollar everything up here. So it's quite interesting to see the planning differential that can happen just based on the fact that we are able to, in a way, hold more US-based investments versus what you are able to do in the US, where it's more like we have to leave it in Canada and then get it here because we really can't manage it from our perspective in the US. So it is a big difference, I find, because we're often managing US dollar portfolios that people have brought up from their RIA, and they haven't had to do much. Maybe they've had to sell their US mutual funds, for example, before coming up. But other than that, they're still holding a lot of the same stuff, so we're not dealing with those same estate planning issues that you mentioned because we do have the assets resident where the clients are.
Yeah, that is interesting because I actually have clients who have RSPs in Canada who will, like, as you kind of talked about, they'll like be able to fluctuate between US dollars and Canadian dollar RSPs, right? Like, that's not a thing here. There's no way like I could call even Schwab up and say, hey, they want to move a bunch of their US money to Canadian money. They would look at me like I'm crazy, right? So that's not an option.
Yeah, I mean, we do have a couple cross-border firms up here who can manage currency and accounts on both sides of the border. I used to be part of one of them, but usually there are asset minimums to those firms as well, which does leave a lot of cross-border individuals exposed and not able to be assisted or managed because they don't have a big enough problem for those advisors to pay attention to. And I think that's the gap that we're really looking to fill is if you don't have somebody or you don't meet their minimums, then, who do you go to? And I think that's why, firms like ours exist. So on that, what kind of challenges are you seeing in today's world when it comes to cross-border retirement planning from the perspective of U.S. residents with Canadian exposure? Like, what's the biggest thing that you see as a challenge for individuals coming to you?
There's a lot, but I would say that the biggest challenge is there's twofold. And I'll say, like, I'm a planner first. I have about 80 to 100 households that I work with, but I'm also a business owner, and we're kind of growing our firm as well. So I'll say, kind of on the planning side, the hardest part is the tax planning, in my opinion, because so much of what we focus on is, okay, if you take money from Canada, what's that going to mean as far as taxes are concerned? How much is going to be withheld? What does that mean for the foreign tax credit? And how do we maximize those foreign tax credits? Which, again, very different than like on your side, because usually the Canada withholding is quite a bit higher than the US tax rate. So there's a lot of strategies behind, like, how do we fill up or utilize that full foreign tax credit? Do we take out really large Canadian retirement withdrawals all at once so that we try to utilize as much as the foreign tax credit? Or do we use just a little bit of those withdrawals on an annual basis so that we keep the taxes lower and have a little bit lower of a withholding? And if that sounds confusing, and then it is, and then trying to explain that to a client is very difficult, right? Because I feel, because I'm like, yeah, it makes sense to take a $500,000 lira withdrawal out this year to maximize your foreign tax credit, which sometimes clients will do. But it's that's very difficult to kind of to model, and then B, to try to explain to somebody why that might be to their advantage, right? So I think that the tax planning is something that I've gotten much better at over the years, and to try to do. I will also say, and this is a gray area to me, Andrea, is the estate planning is still something that, like, we have an idea of what to do estate planning wise when you have Canadian assets, but it doesn't seem like it's always the same, right? Like every client kind of is treated differently depending on the province they're in, and things like that. So the estate planning can also be quite an
Absolutely.
ordeal.
And I think, for anyone listening out here, and you probably as well, focus more on retirement planning, decumulation planning, what to do with assets on both sides of the border. But when it comes to more complex estate planning, I definitely will defer to cross-border lawyers or attorneys to take on that challenge, because it's really just not where I focus my energies as much. I can identify the red flags, as I'm sure you can, and talk about it more generally. But then I do defer to other professionals. So I'd love to hear, who's in your network? Like, what other professionals do you liaise with when you're working with a client? And do you also, are you able to work with a client's existing professional network if they have one?
Yeah. So, we're a little bit interesting in the fact that we actually, and I won't say I refer off to a lot of advisors. Now, again, our expertise, as I mentioned to you before, is U.S. residents. So when somebody moves to Canada, if one of our clients moves to Canada full time, that's typically where we'll kind of offload them. So that, like, we'll help them with like the exit tax planning and leaving the States. But like once they get up to Canada, we would even refer them to you, right, at that point, because that's just not our specialty. We do so much tax planning here. I know enough to kind of be dangerous with Canadian taxes, but certainly not enough to know, right? So we refer a lot of people, but actually a lot of advisors refer people to us as well, which is unique because people will call us and be like, I cannot help this person. I don't understand the situation. And I've looked you up. So some advisors do. We do work with a few cross-border tax preparers. And again, we'll help with a lot of the tax planning. I know the tax planning, but as far as the preparation is concerned, that's not our expertise, right? I review and then talk about, again, a complexity there. I review all of my clients' taxes like you probably do. And I bet you I see 50 different ways a year on how tax advisors will put CPP, OAS, RSP withdrawals here in the States, right? It's always different. And I know what it should look like. I've done it enough. I will kind of use I'm not a tax preparer, but this is kind of what I usually see it looking like, right? Like kind of that big caveat. But so we do have a couple tax preparers that we will actually refer people to. We still have a lot of people who try to kind of stumble their way around TurboTax, which is getting better as well. But that we do refer a lot of people there. And then we have some cross-border estate people, which is tough because of it. And this is what we find to be really difficult, Andrea. And I wish there was a better way to do it. Typically a lawyer is only registered in so many states, right? And we work with clients in probably about 30 states at this point. So it's just hard for us to find a firm that's not, I will say there's a firm that we spoke to, and it's going to be like $12,000 for an estate plan for our clients. And like, so some are really, really expensive, but to find a reasonably priced estate planning attorney cross-border is tough. What I will sometimes do is work with people as a estate planning attorney to just kind of talk to them about, like, again, what do we kind of see? What have we seen some things in the past that you want to be aware of without, like, giving them direct advice?
Yeah, we have the similar challenge on this side of the border. It sounds very, very similar. We have cross-border lawyers who do a great job, but they usually are higher price point and not necessarily accessible to most. But I don't always think that the complexity is there for a lot of individuals to require the strategies that might be put forth in some of these engagements. I'm not saying that they're not valuable. I just don't think that there's always a huge amount of complexity or assets that need to be dealt with to justify the time of the cross-border lawyers. So that's one area to consider. And then secondarily, you're right, when we're dealing with Canadians who have U.S. assets or property, usually property that's left over there is what we're dealing with. We have to find a lawyer who either is in that state or who has someone that they can refer us to in that state, which is more challenging to be able to ensure that the estate planning is done properly for that. So, and luckily in the most cases, we have some cross-border lawyers up here who are registered in Florida as well, which is a big, snowbird state that Canadians tend to hold property in, for example. But it is a challenge. And like you, a lot of times what we're trying to do is just repatriate wealth back to Canada so that we lessen the burden on the estate planning side as much as possible and ensure beneficiary designations are
100%.
used properly, et cetera.
And that's it. It's a lot of it is kind of basic, like, do you have beneficiaries on your accounts, right? I mean, do you need a trust? Even in the US, do you need a trust? But do you need a cross-border trust, which is sometimes sold that isn't necessary, right? For people who may not have physical property in Canada or have much assets in Canada. So those are some of the big challenges that we face as a business owner. I mean, you have talked about this, is how do you find new cross-border planners? Because both of us are very lucky that people are there's a big need for this area, right? So both of us are busy, and it's really hard to find a cross-border financial planner to hire to help us here, right? So it's hard enough just to find a really good planner. I don't know, so much of the so much of our world is investment management and salespeople, right? Like, just to find a really good planner can be difficult, but then to try to find a planner that also would be knowledgeable in cross-border planning is like, I don't know, that would be a needle in a haystack. I feel like I would sit here for 20 years before somebody would apply for that job. So now that one of the big things as we're growing our business is really, how do we get new people in the business? How do we then spend the time to train those people of all of the ins and outs of cross-border
That's the hardest
planning?
part, because I feel like from my perspective, a lot of it was just learned through experience over time, and only time and working on lots of individual client situations will teach you the nuances and the specific instances that come up with cross-border planning. And we're all still learning too. I'm not done learning. I just finished a course a couple weeks ago, because there's so much to know, and there's so much that changes as well as in both countries that will affect what we do. So it is really difficult. I agree. So when it comes to the type of people that come to you that are potentially leaving the US and moving to Canada and are going to be, having that sort of cross-border lifestyle that they're starting, let's just say, what are one or two key things that you would tell a client in that situation that they should know before they come to Canada?
Yeah. So one of the things that you mentioned already was tax rates in Canada are almost always quite a bit higher than the States, right? And so the thing that one of the biggest issues that people have is they'll come to us like a month before they leave the States and they're going to Canada, right? And at that point, it's like, there's not a whole lot we can do at this point, right? If you come to me like 3, 4, 5 years before, we can start to figure out how we can actually accumulate your assets in the States so that you can bring them to Canada tax-free, right? And a lot of times the issues that we have are when people here in the States keep on accumulating pre-tax assets. Like, they could be in Texas with no state tax rate, accumulating all of these assets pre-tax, and then they I had a client move to Nova Scotia, and now they're paying a 50% marginal tax rate where they were earning income at 22% here in the States, right? And so that is probably the biggest thing that we try to tell people is like, if you're moving up to Canada, or at least how things are right now, you have to be aware of the tax issues. the other big thing that you have to be aware of if you're leaving the States and moving to Canada is a potential exit tax as well. And I want to tell you kind of a little, kind of interesting story. I have a client right now. He's like a Bitcoin millionaire, right? He has made about $6 million here in the States on Bitcoin. And he worked for a tech company, which I won't say which one, but who's also, the stock just skyrocketed, right? So he has like $7 million of unrealized capital gains here in the States, and which is a good problem to have. We don't see that very often. Good for him. And he even realizes like, okay, I've hit the lotto, right? Basically, he's a green card holder. And if you are a green card holder for 8 years and you leave the States and you have a net worth over $2 million, there is an exit tax upon leaving the States, right? And it means that you have to give up, or you basically sell all of your assets the day before you leave. And for somebody like him, that might mean $1 million in capital gains taxes, right? An unbelievable amount. And for him, by leaving this year, which he'll only be a green card holder for 7 years, as opposed to 8 next year, where he would have been a green card holder for 8 years, he can leave the States completely tax-free this year versus next year, right? So it's like probably $1 million savings for him to
and the
wait
fact
to
that he
leave.
came to you early enough to recognize that complication, I'm sure he's very thankful. I would assume.
Yeah, well, he doesn't know, right? Like most people don't even know that this is a thing. He just is like, hey, Bryan, I'm going to retire in 24. I'm moving to this to Canada in 25. When we started digging in, I was like, you need to leave the States in 24 or you're going to be subject to a gigantic. Right? So there's just, people don't know that. And that's another thing that you want to be aware of is like, are you going to be hit with a pretty large tax by just leaving the States, right? And it is possible. And then we'll send them to you, and then you can deal with that, Andrea, once they're up in Canada.
Well, and that's called being a covered expatriate. I'm sure people may have heard that terminology, not knowing what that means, but it's a really important challenge, let's just say, for a lot of clients that I've seen in the past who are trying to leave the U.S. And there is some planning that you can do. Sometimes you have let's say one U.S. spouse and one isn't, where you're trying to, in a way, shift assets between spouses to get under the threshold for paying the exit tax. There's some strategies that I'm sure that you can discuss with your clients to try to assist in certain cases, perhaps not all cases, to help them with that.
Yeah, we do a lot of exit tax planning. Like how do we even up assets? How do we, again, try to, even if you are going to be subject to the exit tax, is there ways to start to decumulate your assets here in the States so that when you do leave, it's not nearly as painful when you leave, and then also once you're up in Canada as well. And I shouldn't say it's always. I mean, you could be moving from a high tax state and being a high tax here to a lower tax province. But we tend to find that on average, taxes up in Canada are maybe 10 or 12%. Just income taxes are maybe 10 or 12% higher than what they are here in the States.
It always baffles my mind that people will still willingly come here knowing that and knowing what a difference it is going to make. Yeah. But obviously they're coming for other reasons as well.
Well, it's lower healthcare, Andrea. That's what all of my clients tell me. And they'll also say, but my dollar goes farther. So I do understand that until they come up there, until they get to Canada, they say, well, my cost of living is also 20% more. It all kind of evens out, right?
Yeah.
So
yeah, it depends where you live too, right? Different areas, different cost of living, and
yes.
And there's a lot of challenges as well once people come up to Canada to establish permanent residency and where they need to be, what province they need to situate themselves into to have better chances of obtaining PR status if they're not a Canadian citizen, let's just say already. So there's a lot of challenges, and I agree with you in that people come to us often where it's too late. I had a consultation this year with someone who was leaving 2 days after speaking with me. And I mean, listen, I can try, but you got to, it's too late, right?
Sure.
So I think often if you're even thinking about it and it's a couple years down the road, that's the best time to start talking to somebody to understand what are the complexities that you ought to be aware of to help you plan your timelines appropriately?
Absolutely. Yeah. And especially crossing the border is it's a big,
A
a
lot of
lot of
planning.
planning.
So, sort of in summation, before we kind of close this, I'd love to know, what is your favorite thing about being a financial planner?
I think this is actually maybe even changed since now that I'm a cross-border financial planner. I felt like it, and I'll say this, in the past, a lot of times when people meet with a financial planner, it's like, hey, I'm meeting with like you and this company and this company and this company, and like, what are your fees? And like, how much, what's your investment performance, right? And it's like, all right, well, like, but now, like, what I love about what I do, it's like when somebody finds you, they're so happy to talk to you. They're like, I've tried to talk to you, I've talked to 30 financial planners in the last 40 years and nobody's been able to help me out with this stuff, right? So it has been, the cross-border stuff has been so gratifying. Even, we do a lot of stuff online with like YouTube videos, and people are just so happy to be able to get some knowledge about this area in which they didn't have before. And just I'm working with a couple right now, and they were like, hopefully I can retire in 4 or 5 years, we don't know. And then you start to put together like how much they're going to get from CPP and OAS and Social Security, and like what the RIFs, and like they're a lot of times blown away by just how much money is going to come to them that nobody's kind of explained to them about. So to me, that is by far the best part about what I do, which is really, I think, eye-opening for people to understand and put all this together. And again, I know being just a normal financial planner is also extremely great. I love doing it, but the cross-border stuff, it just feels like people are even more thankful in that area.
We're
right?
helping people. At the end of the day, that's what it's all about. And I think that's, for those listening as well, what I find clients get frustrated with is the differentiation between a financial advisor and a financial planner, and not really understanding that difference. And I think you explained it there, quite succinctly from a cross-border planning standpoint, what our value proposition truly is. It's not on the accounts and the asset allocation. That has really nothing to do with cross-border financial planning at all. That's sort of, that's
exactly
investment specific asset allocation planning. That's really not what we focus on per se. So I think, we lead with the planning, and then the investments come after that, and we don't manage investments, but that's the piece that comes after you put the puzzle pieces together. And I think that's what people ought to know is we're trying to create the picture on the front of the box, so to speak.
I need to like take that and put it on my website or something. Like, that's a fantastic way of saying what we do and the differential that we have, because it's 100% true. People are always surprised when they come to us that we don't talk about their investments until like the 5th meeting, right? Like, we're doing everything else and then talking about their investments, where every other financial advisor they've worked with, it's like, let's start with the investments and then maybe we'll talk about the other stuff later, right?
Lead with the planning, which I love. Lastly, where can people find you, Bryan?
Yeah, you can go to my website. It's retiremitten.com. Now you will know what that actually means if you listen to the beginning of this. We also do some YouTube stuff. We're starting to, which hopefully has been educational, and that's under that's our Retire Mitten Financial YouTube site. So hopefully starting to put more and more content up there as well.
Thank you for that. And I'll link all that in the show notes today for anyone who's listening. And this is also going to be on YouTube. So if you want to check out Bryan and I talking in our individual home workspaces, you can go check that out on our on my YouTube channel. And I think it might be up on Bryan's as well. So thank you. I really appreciate the conversation today, Bryan. It was so great to have you on, and have a wonderful summer.